Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. Dr. Munamato Chemhuru is Associate Professor in Philosophy at Great Zimbabwe University in Masvingo, Zimbabwe, and he's a Senior Research Associate in Philosophy at the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. He's been working on a project called Conceptualising Environmental Justice through Epistemic Justice in Africa, collaborating with former podcast guest Jamie Dow. Munamato's research highlights the way Africans have been subjected to epistemic injustice in the debate around environmental ethics and the distribution of environmental benefits and burdens. That's to say, African voices are often ignored, misinterpreted, or not taken seriously. This injustice extends to the theoretical frameworks which are used to conceptualise environmental ethics. And towards the end of the interview, Munamato introduces unhu ubuntu as an alternative ethical framework which promises to enrich our understanding of the ethical terrain in which environmental responsibilities are grounded. Welcome to the podcast, Munamato.
Okay, hi Jim, thank you very much and thanks for having me today.
No problem, I'm looking forward to the conversation. And we're here to talk about your research on environmental justice and epistemic justice in the context of Africa and conversations around climate change and the environment generally. So I wondered if you could start by just setting the scene and tell me what you mean by environmental justice. What is environmental justice?
Okay. Thank you very much, Jim, for that important question. My research broadly is focusing on trying to conceptualize environmental justice through epistemic justice in Africa. And generally, environmental justice is really concerned with a broad range of issues. And such issues may actually have to do with access to and distribution of environmentally derived natural resources. You can actually think of aspects like the land, mineral resources, water bodies, natural forests, and even non-human animals, which are part of what I might call environmental capital that ought to be fairly distributed across the world. So in addition to the possibility of access to and distribution of these natural resources, environmental justice is also concerned with options and possibilities for how to equitably or fairly distribute burdens or environmental risks and impacts that are actually derived from use and utilization of such environmental capital. And by environmental capital, I'm looking at environmental goods services. So such risks and impacts may include, but are not limited to, aspects like the global temperature increases that we currently witness, heat waves, aspects like floods, recurrent tropical cyclones, prolonged droughts, rising sea levels, loss of life, poverty, and population displacements, among others. So the moment we try to think of how to distribute these across different communities, we are actually grappling with environmental justice issues. So broadly, I consider for justice or equity might be applied to different relationships between human beings as they interact and relate with these different aspects of the natural environment.
Right. So so you've outlined there some of the kind of goods or benefits that can come from environmental phenomena. And there are kind of harms that can arise from, the way the environment is exploited and damage that's caused to the environment. And people might be familiar with the idea of a kind of distributive injustice that there is within environmental justice. So, poorer people, non-white people, women, people in the global south, for example, might disproportionately bear the effects of environmental damage, might disproportionately not have access to the goods arising from the environment. But their contribution to the damage, to environmental damage, which causes environmental harms, might be disproportionately small, right? So that's one form of environmental injustice that people might be familiar with, and there's a conversation around that kind of environmental injustice. So that's familiar, but your research is looking at environmental justice not in that kind of basic distributive way, but through the lens of epistemic injustice. So could you say a bit about what you mean by epistemic injustice, please?
Okay, thank you very much for that. That injustice is actually inequity or unfairness generally. So epistemic injustice has to do with injustice which is within the epistemological realm. It is the kind of injustice that affects our access to knowledge.
This word epistemic might be confusing some people who are listening who aren't philosophers, but basically when we talk about epistemic phenomena or epistemology, that's the study of knowledge. So that we're talking about knowledge or belief, right?
When we look at epistemic injustice, in other words, it is the kind of injustice that affects those distributive patterns of epistemic goods. And the knowledge is one of the most fundamental aspects of an epistemic good. When we think of knowledge or information in general. So if an individual is, for example, denied access to knowledge, access to education, access to things like wisdom, understanding, truth, or even information, they are actually epistemically disadvantaged.
Yes, okay.
So that would be some sort of, so that is epistemic injustice.
This initial form of epistemic justice that you've introduced there is still a form of distributive justice. So we talked about the distribution of material benefits and material harm. So that's one form of distributive justice that we might be interested in. But there's also a kind of distributive question about epistemic goods. So we ought to also be concerned, is your suggestion, about the way knowledge, understanding and so on are distributed among people. So some people, as well as not having access to their fair share of material goods, might also not have access to their fair share of knowledge and of understanding and so on.
Oh, yes, that's true. Yeah, I'm actually concerned with the distributive patterns of both epistemic goods and environmental goods.
Yeah.
So I am considering that nexus, so that relationship subsisting between the distributive patterns of epistemic goods like knowledge, understanding, and information in terms of what their implications might be for also the distributive patterns of environmental justice across the world. So in this research, I actually see a very strong connection between those distributive patterns of epistemic goods and environmental goods.
Could you tell me a bit about some ways in which people might not have access to their fair share of knowledge or understanding about environmental matters? Could you give some examples of how that might play out?
Oh, I would say that if you look at the African context, for example, there's a sense in which there is a very strong connection between epistemic injustice and environmental injustice, to the extent that if someone lacks epistemic goods, such as knowledge and understanding, they're likely also going to suffer with regard to environmental injustice or the question of environmental justice. So if you look at the story of environmental injustice, for example, which is a very long history that somewhat stretches back to like the slave trade and pre-colonial era, where, for example, through slavery, racism, colonialism, and the false promise of modernity, these have been some of the major anchors of not only environmental injustice in Africa, but also epistemic injustice. So such kind of practices and ideologies have largely been responsible for typical environmental injustice through not only physical conquest, but also land dispossessions, promotion poverty leading to unfair distributive patterns of natural resources, land, and access to means of production. So the first point to realize is that through coloniality, for example, the individual is kind of epistemically disadvantaged. And that process of epistemic disadvantaging the person would actually followed by environmental injustice.
Okay, yes, I can see that. So, so there are ways in which kind of knowledge and understanding, I guess through education and so on, are not equitably distributed, and people might be disadvantaged in that way. But in addition to that, you're also interested in discriminatory epistemic injustice, which is a different form of epistemic injustice. So could you tell me a bit about what discriminatory epistemic injustice is, please?
Discriminatory epistemic injustice, for me, I look at it as involving not only unequal social access to epistemic goods like information, truth, and the like, but it is actually a kind of injustice that involves the epistemic agent, or actually the person, being systematically wronged as a subject of knowledge or an epistemic agent. So this might entail the person's testimony or his claim for knowledge actually being intentionally or unintentionally not being listened to or misunderstood on the basis of various aspects like prejudices or biases or partiality. For example, you can think of a situation when you are not listened to, or your testimony or your claim for knowledge is actually not given serious attention, usually on the basis of your race, your gender, or your sexuality. So that would constitute what I would look at as discriminatory epistemic injustice, because the subject in that case is actually being discriminated, or the basis for not accepting the claims of the subject is actually discrimination.
Just to kind of put that in a context which I suppose our listeners might understand. So an example of discriminatory epistemic injustice, which kind of occurred to me a few years ago. Me and my partner were on holiday, and we were staying at an Airbnb. And the man who owned the Airbnb, because my name's Jim Baxter, and Jim Baxter's a famous footballer, right? A famous football player from the UK from back in the day. And this guy wanted to talk to me about football because of that. And he kept talking to me about football. And my partner, who's a woman, knows much more about football than I do. I'm not really very knowledgeable about football at all. But he kind of kept asking me questions and ignoring what she was saying. And it's clearly because, I'm a man. So he assumed I would know about this. I would have access to, knowledge about this particular domain, and that she wouldn't. So in a relatively unimportant way, he was kind of subjecting her to a kind of discriminatory epistemic injustice, right, in that case. But you can see how kind of this might happen on a much broader scale when you're talking about things like, talking about the impacts of the environment in Africa, and that people might might be kind of systematically discriminated against when they're trying to make a contribution to these important conversations, and yet what they're saying is not being taken seriously. So, yeah, could you tell me a bit about how that plays out in the African environmental context?
Oh, yes. Actually, discriminatory epistemic injustice actually is sometimes kind of twofold, or it can take two forms. It can either be testimonial, or it can actually be some experience at the hermeneutical level. So, discriminatory epistemic justice, like I said, is the one that is more epistemic, can actually be testimonial or hermeneutical, although testimonial epistemic injustice almost always leads into hermeneutical epistemic injustice. Right. So firstly, testimonial epistemic injustice generally revolves around unfairness, usually related to trusting one's word. It is the kind of injustice which is usually some sort of an individual to individual harm, which occurs when issues of partiality, bias, and other misconceptions, such as, like I have said, conceptions of race, gender, and sexuality, may actually get in the way of the hearer and mislead them to have a bias to the extent of not trusting or listening to their knowledge claim, right, simply on the basis of those prejudices. So not listening to, for example, within the environmental ethical context, like you think of a situation where we may not, or African people may not be listened to with regard to environmental injustice concerns on the basis of, for example, who they are, or like you will notice that African people are usually racialized, othered, and they're generally largely poor and underdeveloped. So if you tend to, if we have a situation where these kind of people are not listened to on the basis of this, it will be some form of a testimonial epistemic injustice. So in most cases, you'll see that contributions from African thinkers on environmental justice and injustice issues are often ignored, usually on the basis of these kind of prejudices. So that will be some sort of a testimonial epistemic injustice. While hermeneutical epistemic injustice, which, like I have said, might also be a result of testimonial injustice, occurs when someone's experiences are not fully understood, either by themselves or by others, because such experiences do not fit any experiences known to them. It might be due to historical exclusion. And in most cases, such kind of epistemic injustice might be caused by not being able to understand or make intelligible one's social experience, yes, as the collective hermeneutical. Like to put it within the context of African environmental ethics, when it comes to environmental injustice in Africa, sometimes African people usually fail to understand and even fail to articulate environmental injustice issues affecting them, such as land imbalances, for example, lack of access to environmental capital, all of which might have been caused by their colonial past. And sometimes when they seek to address or to express such issues, they may not be taken seriously, especially by those who do not know about their history of colonialism and its effect on environmental injustice in Africa. So I see that as ultimately constituting a hermeneutical kind of epistemic injustice.
Good. Yeah. Okay. So we've got an interesting distinction there, which it might be worth, again, just recapitulating. So you talked about the distinction between testimonial epistemic injustice and hermeneutical epistemic injustice. So basically the distinction there is testimonial epistemic injustice involves not taking the person seriously on the basis of some characteristic that they have, and I guess your biases and prejudices towards people with that characteristic. Hermeneutical injustice is more to do with the kind of epistemic frameworks that people are using, the terms in which they're expressing themselves, and your ability to, or one's ability to hear and understand and make sense of those expressions, right? So, and I guess the thing is, both of those kinds of injustice are going to go hand in hand, aren't they? So it might be that, you know, a listener's having trouble making sense of what the speaker is saying, because and it takes effort, right? It takes effort to actually try to get your head around a slightly different kind of set of concepts that the person might be using. But if you're also subjecting that person to testimonial injustice, you're not going to make that effort because you're not going to think it's worthwhile. Instead of thinking, somebody's saying something here which I don't quite understand, how can I try to understand better? You're going to think you'll be tempted to dismiss what the person's saying, because you're also subjecting them to that basic testimonial injustice. You're also saying, you're also bringing to the table a prejudice which says what that person is saying is less worth taking seriously than somebody else's might be. Yeah. Okay, good. So it seems like both of those kinds of injustice are taking place in the context of environmental conversations, having to do with Africa. And you said that this is the product of a history of colonialism. So could you say a bit more about that? So why does the colonial past here affect the way people's voices are and are not listened to in the present?
My view is that actually colonialism has had very strong implications for epistemic injustice and actually environmental injustice in Africa. Like I've already alluded to, in Africa, colonialism actually has perpetuated both distributive and discriminatory epistemic injustice through physical conquest, racial discrimination, and particularly dispossession against indigenous African people who were actually dispossessed of their land and the natural resources. So this ultimately was the basis for their physical and even mental or epistemic and environmental subjugation, which is even more responsible for current environmental injustice today. So colonialism, I would say, was the main culprit in instilling epistemic injustice and social injustice in Africa, such that due to colonialism, the neo-colonial policies, or due to colonialism and maybe some neo-colonial policies, most indigenous African populations are still dispossessed of land and natural resources, which were their major sources of livelihood. So when they seek environmental justice through, for example, the quest for fair distributions, participation, recognition, and land reform and redistributions, they are not usually taken seriously by those who claim epistemic hegemony because of those preconceived prejudices which characterize African people as incapable, irresponsible, and unintelligible. They are thus continuously, they are thus kind of subjected to discriminatory and epistemic injustice, which manifests either testimonially or hermeneutically.
Okay, thanks. I think at one point in the paper, you make the point that there's often a very heavy and perhaps exclusive emphasis on scientific knowledge as the basis for decisions around things that affect the distribution of environmental goods and harms. So you talk about the siting of environmentally damaging facilities such as mines or waste disposal sites, and the kind of conversations that go into making those decisions, very strongly emphasize scientific knowledge as what's important to make good decisions there. And you think that might be one, am I right in thinking you think that might be one source of this kind of testimonial injustice? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So how does that work? So why is this emphasis on scientific knowledge problematic in that way?
Okay. Oh, yes, that's a very important question. And I appreciate the question is actually an important one. At some level, I might be understood as if I seek to argue against the science or against scientific knowledge by my appeal to African indigenous knowledge. But however, I do not wish to be understood that way. My point is that African indigenous knowledge generally is often excluded from meaning making about important environmental justice issues because of misconceptions and misinterpretations based on the assumptions that such knowledge is unscientific. And that it is a kind of, and that is ultimately a kind of epistemic injustice which African indigenous knowledge continues to face. So in order to address such kind of epistemic injustice, I seek to propose the need for African indigenous knowledge to be actually recognized so that it can also contribute to meaning making about environmental justice decisions in Africa.
Yeah, good. So as an ethicist, I might want to make the point more generally, actually, that kind of decisions around things like that, practical questions like that, there is often an assumption that scientific knowledge is all you need. And actually, you can't make any decision without also bringing into play questions about values, right? Yeah, and of course, it's not to say that scientific knowledge isn't important or that science isn't a good way of kind of arriving at kind of factual knowledge, which should feed into these decisions. But there is also going to have to be some kind of value framework in play. Your point is that value framework also should include thinking about values and about ethics that comes from the African context, right? As well as the kind of Western theories of ethics that we in this part of the world where I am might be more familiar with. How do you understand the way environmental ethics is conceptualized typically and how that excludes African perspectives?
Yeah, maybe I think we might need to remember before we look at how African ethics might actually contribute to environmental ethics debates. We might need maybe to recall the story of African philosophy in general. And it is actually until recently, around the end of the last century or the 20th century, that the debate around the skepticism about African philosophy was almost settled. Otherwise, prior to that, African philosophy somewhat did not exist in the eyes of some non-African thinkers who followed the footsteps of Hegel and Immanuel Kant in denying the existence of philosophy in Africa. So similarly, African ethics has also been kind of othered for a long time, owing to that kind of history of denial of African philosophy and its indigenous knowledge. And for that reason, it is why African ethics has generally been taken as some sort of second-order discourse relative to the dominant or other dominant ethical theories in non-African traditions. We may think of virtue ethics, utilitarianism, and deontology in terms of how they are generally influential. African ethics has generally been othered for a long time, owing to the history of denial of African philosophy. And the same reasons are also responsible for shaping African ethics, which is generally taken as some sort of a second-order discourse in comparison with other dominant normative ethical theories in non-African traditions. such as virtue ethics, utilitarianism, and deontological ethical theories, which are almost very influential in other non-African philosophical traditions. So the appeal to such theories in addressing environmental injustice in Africa is a form of what I would look at as epistemic injustice, because the African theories of ethics are taken as epistemically lesser as opposed to these dominant non-African theories. And you realize that even today, except for a few philosophers or a few non-African philosophers, such as Thaddeus Metz and Kai Ostemki, you find very few non-African philosophers who are willing or eager to actually really engage with African ethical issues.
Yeah, so our listeners might be familiar with, if you've ever done a kind of introductory ethics course, you might get, some time on virtue ethics and Aristotle. You might get something on deontology and Immanuel Kant and so on. You might get some stuff on utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham. And then you might get something on other forms of ethics or other ethical theories, and you might get like a bit on African ethics. You might get a bit on, Chinese ethics or ethics in the Indian tradition. But these are kind of tacked on at the end, right? They're not sort of seen as central in the same way that those Western theories are seen. And that seems particularly problematic. That kind of othering or marginalization of those ways of thinking is particularly problematic when we're talking about conversations happening about things which directly affect Africans, and when their own kind of intellectual traditions aren't being taken seriously. That seems like a particularly harmful way of doing things. And so one concept from African ethics which you're particularly interested in kind of reintroducing, and which you think might have something useful to contribute to conversations around environmental ethics, is this concept of unhu or ubuntu. Could you tell me a bit about what that concept is and why you think that's important and we should take that seriously?
The notion of actually unhu or ubuntu is mostly prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa. And I must say that this idea of unhu or ubuntu is one of the most difficult concepts to actually define in African philosophy, because actually different people understand it differently. So some people may actually want to understand it from its ontological and epistemological perspective, where, for example, the nomenclature itself, unhu or ubuntu, u and nu or u and ubuntu, are actually derived. So those epistemological and ontological connotations of the word itself might actually influence the way most people actually would want to understand it. But however, others may also want to just consider it as just a moral theory in African philosophy. But the way I use it loosely, I take unhu or ubuntu to be generally an African philosophy of communitarian existence, of relational and humane existence, which is based on an understanding of conceptions of the person first, and the way that conception of the person will ultimately give humans a view of how to exist with others and the surrounding world. So if we take unhu or ubuntu, it is usually captured by the famous expression that a person is a person through others, meaning that one's existence is understood by making reference to how that person actually exists with others. So it is therefore kind of a relational view of existence, a humane way of, or a communitarian view of existence, in which if we want to understand the human being, we have to look at how that human being actually relates with other people.
Good. Yeah. So I guess one way we might think of how that could be different from ethical theories deriving from the Western tradition would be that those theories tend to be, to a greater or lesser extent, individualistic. So when we talk about virtue ethics, Aristotle was concerned with what an individual should be like, what kinds of virtues should they have, what kinds of characters should they have. In deontology, it's about what duties do we have, right? So what duties do I have as an individual? And in the same way, kind of utilitarianism is about kind of what's the right decision that I should make and kind of weighing up the kind of claims of other people in my decision making. But this concept you're saying is about the way people are kind of deeply related, and it's not about making individual decisions. It's about a kind of collectiveness or communitarian way of looking at things on quite a deep level. So I just want to get back to what you said at the beginning of that last set of comments. So you said that there could be an ontological element to this, and an epistemic element to it, as well as an ethical one. So ontology, in philosophical jargon, is kind of about the way things are, right? So you could kind of understand this kind of connectedness, this relationality, as being a claim about how things are kind of on a deep level, that we are all very deeply connected to each other. And it's not just about humans being connected to other humans, it's humans to non-human animals and to elements of the natural environment and so on. But that has kind of ethical implications. So it would make a difference to how we can treat other people and treat animals and so on. I was wondering, could you give an example of how a practical difference that taking seriously that kind of conception of ethics might make to a decision that one might make in the environmental context? Like, what difference would it make to how people make these decisions and what decisions they might make?
Okay. So looking at its ontological and epistemic implications for environmental ethics, unhu or ubuntu actually promises to foster a comprehensive view of non-anthropocentric environmental ethics, right? A complete view of an environmental ethics that takes into consideration others, or other human persons and other non-human persons. So, because of its ontological implications and epistemic implications for others, because the person understands themselves as not only the individual, but existing with others. So I consider it as a comprehensive view of ethical thinking, as it takes into consideration the need to care for not only other human persons, such as those that one might be related and communing with, but also the concerns of nature and even future generations and non-human beings are also taken into consideration.
Yeah.
For example, you might be interested in seeing that the way African people may actually consider a person as lacking or ubuntu, or lacking humaneness, on the basis on which such a person may treat or mistreat different aspects of nature, such as animal beings or even physical nature. There are situations where, for example, a person, if you mistreat a certain aspect of nature, which is not necessarily a human person, like it might be an animal, we may look at that person as lacking in other words, that person lacks humaneness. So it is because the human person or human beings have certain moral obligations towards not only human beings, but even those that are not necessarily human beings. So I see this kind of ethical thinking as capable of informing us of a sound environmental ethical thinking.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, so it might kind of just in the context of, you know, the examples that you used around the siting of environmentally damaging facilities. So you wouldn't then be kind of just weighing up in a utilitarian way, you know, how much harm there's going to be to how many people and kind of making a calculus in that way. You would have to kind of take seriously just damage to the environment in it for its own sake, and damage to, you know, plants and trees and non-human animals, you know, would just be something that would have to go into that decision as well. It wouldn't just be a matter of weighing up harms to people, and even, you know, whether it's kind of currently existing people or future generations and so on. It's thinking about your kind of fundamental connectedness to the environment, and taking that seriously in the decision that you make.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, that's wonderful. Is there anything that you wanted to say that we haven't had a chance to cover before we finish?
No, I think it's fine.
Well, that's fabulous. In that case, Munamato Chemhuru, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, thank you very much, Jim.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.